Imagine finding out the treatment that's supposed to be saving your life. It might actually be doing the opposite.
Yeah.
That's what happened to thousands of people in the UK during the infected blood scandal.
Right.
It happened over decades, from the 70s all the way to the early 90s.
Wow.
We're going to dive deep today to try to understand how blood products that were meant to help people with hemophilia ended up spreading hepatitis C and HIV.
It's a really, really sad story.
Yeah, the human cost was unbelievable. Over 3,000 people died that we know of.
And probably a lot more that we don't know about.
Exactly. And to help us understand this whole complicated and heartbreaking story, we have an expert who studied it extensively.
Thanks for having me.
I have to say, I only kind of have a vague idea of what happened,
Sure.
so I'm really looking forward to learning more.
Well, it's great to be here. And yeah, it is a really complicated story, but it's one that needs to be told.
Yeah.
So why don't we start by making sure we both understand hemophilia the same way?
Okay, that's a good place to start. I know it's something to do with blood clotting.
Yeah.
Can you give me a simple explanation of exactly what it is?
Absolutely. So hemophilia is a genetic disorder, and basically it prevents blood from clotting properly. People with hemophilia lack certain proteins that we call clotting factors that are crucial for stopping bleeding.
Okay.
And that means even a small injury can lead to dangerous bleeding.
I see. So before the 1970s, how did they treat hemophilia?
Well, before they had factor concentrates, the treatment options were really limited.
Yeah.
Often they had to do whole blood transfusions or plasma transfusions,
Oh, wow.
which had their own set of risks like allergic reaction.
I imagine it's not very targeted.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
So it wasn't ideal, and a lot of people with hemophilia had to deal with a lot of challenges and health risks.
And then came factor concentrates, which were a breakthrough, right?
That's right. In the 70s, factor concentrates were a revolutionary treatment. They were basically purified clotting factors taken from donated blood plasma, and this meant that people with hemophilia could manage their condition way more effectively and have a much better quality of life.
That's fantastic. But how did something that sounds so promising turn into this huge infection problem?
Well, that's where things get complicated and tragic.
Okay.
The manufacturing process is a big part of it. To make these concentrates, they used to pool plasma from a ton of donors, sometimes up to 60,000 in a single batch.
Wow, 60,000 donors in one batch.
Yeah.
So if even one person in that huge group had a blood-borne infection like hepatitis C or HIV,
Yeah.
then the whole batch would be contaminated.
Exactly. And a lot of these concentrates came from the U.S., and some of those plasma collection centers used high-risk donors.
Oh, no.
Like prisoners and drug addicts who are more likely to carry those infections.
That's awful. Knowing those risks with all that pooled plasma, did they try to screen donors?
Well, there were some screening procedures,
Yeah.
but they weren't good enough to catch all the infections. And even worse, there were a lot of early warnings about the risks that weren't taken seriously enough.
Really?
Yeah, way back in 1974, an American scientist named Judith Graham Poole, she was really worried about it. She called these blood products dangerous and unethical.
That's crazy that they knew about the risks so early on, even before the scandal really broke out.
I know.
Did anybody listen to her?
Some people did, but not enough of the people in charge. The World Health Organization even said that countries shouldn't import blood from places with a lot of hepatitis, which they were specifically talking about the United States.
Wow. And the UK still kept importing all this blood.
Yeah, because they hadn't figured out how to make enough of their own blood products yet.
That seems like a huge oversight.
It was a big problem.
Yeah.
And a big part of why everything happened.
So the UK is importing these factor concentrates, even though they know they're risky, and that's kind of what set the stage for everything that happened.
Yeah.
When did they start realizing there was a problem?
Well, the first infections started popping up in the late 70s and early 80s,
Right.
mostly hepatitis C. And there was a study in 1983 that showed if hemophiliacs used untreated factor concentrates, they had a 100% chance of getting hepatitis C.
100%.
Yeah.
That's just unbelievable. What did they do when they found that out?
Well, you would think that would have been a huge wake-up call and they would take an action right away.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the initial response wasn't as strong as it should have been.
Oh, wow.
And then on top of the hepatitis C crisis, HIV/AIDS came along in the early 80s.
Oh, no.
And that made a terrible situation even worse.
Yeah.
So now you have the treatment that's supposed to be helping people with hemophilia,
Right.
but it's actually putting them at risk of two deadly viruses.
Wow.
And you can only imagine the fear and uncertainty that caused in the hemophilia community.
It must have been terrifying. Did anyone try to warn people or stop using those contaminated products?
Yeah, there were warnings for sure, and they came from really credible sources.
Okay.
In May of 1983, Spence Galbraith, who was the director of the Communicable Disease Surveillance Center in England and Wales,
Okay.
he sent a paper to the Department of Health.
Hmm.
He was basically saying, we need to stop using all U.S. blood products right now because they could transmit AIDS.
Wow, so this wasn't just speculation. It was a direct warning based on science.
Right, and it was urgent.
Yeah. What did the government do?
Well, unfortunately, even though there was a clear danger, the UK government kept importing and using those blood products.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty shocking. And in November of 1983, Kenneth Clark,
Who was that?
he was the Secretary of State for Health at the time.
Okay.
Well, he actually told Parliament that there was no conclusive evidence that blood products could transmit AIDS.
You're kidding.
Nope.
So even with all the warnings and the evidence, they were still downplaying the risks.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what they were thinking.
Yeah, for sure. So what happened next? As the AIDS crisis got worse, did things finally change?
Sadly, no. The number of hemophiliacs getting infected with HIV just kept going up. And the government didn't really do much. There wasn't a lot of financial support. And what there was came from charitable trusts,
Well, wow.
which meant you had to prove you needed the money, and it was never enough to really compensate people.
So not only were these people and their families dealing with these horrible illnesses,
Right.
they had to pay for everything themselves
Even not.
with almost no help from the people who were responsible for it all.
Exactly.
That's heartbreaking. Did anybody try to hold the government accountable?
It took decades before there was any accountability.
Wow.
In 2009, Lord Archer, who was a former Solicitor General for England and Wales, he led a privately funded investigation.
Okay.
It was called the Archer Report. It's important to remember that this wasn't an official government inquiry,
Yeah.
but it did help expose a lot of the negligence and problems that led to the scandal.
So the Archer report was unofficial, but it was a step in the right direction.
Absolutely.
What did they find out?
A lot of really bad stuff.
Like?
Well, they pointed out that the UK never figured out how to make enough blood products on their own, even after they were warned about imported concentrates.
Wow.
They also found out that the UK was really slow to start using safety measures, like heat treatment.
What's heat treatment?
It's a way to treat the blood products to kill viruses.
Oh, okay.
It could have stopped a lot of those infections.
That's unbelievable. That something so simple that could have saved so many lives
I know.
was implemented so slowly. So the Archer report exposed all these problems, but did it change anything?
Not right away. It took until 2017,
Wow.
after years and years of people fighting for it, before
Yeah.
Prime Minister Theresa May finally said they would have a full public inquiry into the infected blood scandal.
Okay.
This was called the Infected Blood Inquiry, and it was supposed to look into how the scandal happened, what the government did, and how it affected victims.
So after all that time, the victims finally had a chance to tell their stories and get to the truth.
Exactly. They deserve to be heard.
Yeah, for sure. What happened with the inquiry? Did it help get justice for the victims?
Well, the inquiry finished in May 2024.
Okay.
After 6 long years of gathering evidence and listening to people's stories,
Wow.
and the findings were really powerful.
What did they say?
They said that the whole scandal could have been prevented, and they condemned all the attempts to cover it up.
Wow.
They said that the government didn't screen blood donors properly, they were slow to implement safety measures like heat treatment, and they didn't provide enough support to the people who were infected. They also talked about the culture of secrecy and denial that went on for decades.
That's awful.
Yeah, it prevented the victims from getting the justice they deserved.
Well, it sounds like those findings are really sad,
They are.
but at least they finally acknowledged all the suffering that people went through.
That's true.
So what happened after the inquiry? Did anything concrete come out of it, like compensation or accountability?
Yeah, the inquiry led to some really big steps towards justice.
Okay, like what?
Well, in 2022, they started giving interim compensation payments, up to £100,000 to surviving victims and their families,
Wow.
which was really important to show that they needed financial support right away.
Yeah, for sure.
And the inquiry also recommended a new, more comprehensive compensation scheme,
Okay.
which finally started in May 2024.
So after all those years, they're finally starting to do something to fix the wrongs of the past.
Yeah, it's a step in the right direction.
Can you tell me more about this new compensation scheme?
Yeah, sure.
What does it actually mean for the victims and their families?
Basically, it's a way to give people more substantial compensation because it takes into account how these infections affect people their whole lives.
Hmm.
It's not just about medical bills and lost income.
Okay.
It also tries to address the emotional distress, the lost opportunities, and how it impacted families.
Obviously, no amount of money can really make up for the pain and suffering that people went through,
No, of course not.
but it's so important that they have some financial security and that what happened to them is acknowledged.
Absolutely.
This new compensation scheme sounds like a good start.
It is. It shows they're finally taking it seriously.
Yeah, it's just awful that it took so long.
Hmm.
The infected blood scandal is a powerful reminder of what can happen when patient safety isn't taken seriously.
That's a really important point. This isn't just a story about something that happened in the past.
Hmm.
It's a reminder that we need to be vigilant about blood safety
Yeah,
and about all aspects of healthcare.
for sure.
We have to demand transparency and accountability from the people who are responsible for keeping us healthy.
Absolutely.
So,
This
yeah,
has been a really eye-opening conversation.
I'm glad.
I had no idea the scandal was so widespread and that it had such a devastating impact.
It's a story that needs to be told.
Yeah,
The victims and their families deserve to have their stories heard and to get justice.
absolutely.